Okay, so this is segment 2 of chapter 29. We're talking about plants again. However, we're moving into the plant phylogeny of actually specifically seedless plants. Now, we talked about some key traits of land plants in general, but we're going to talk about some key traits of the vascular plants once we get to that section. So, really, this is including some distinct characteristics of. This is an abbreviated. A lot of the details will be covered for gymnosperms and angiosperms in the next chapter. So we're only going to be dealing with the seedless plants. So the seed plants are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The seedless plants are all the other ones here. So here, I just want to kind of point out that we have those seedless plants that are non-vascular and those that are vascular. Now, seed plants are also vascular, but then there's also plants that do not have seeds or produce seeds that have vascular tissue. So the ones that are non-vascular are called collectively the bryophytes. Together, these make up a grade, not a clade. They're not, a true clade, but they do have the same characteristics. They have basically no vascular tissue, and that's pretty much it, right? So they're plants, they're land plants, and they do not have vascular tissue. Now, this includes, again, the term bryophytes is different from bryophyta, which we're going to see later, right? So the bryophytes include all of the non-vascular plants, okay, which are also seedless, of course, which include the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts. And we'll be talking about in this segment for this particular chapter, we'll also be discussing some vascular plants. However, they're seedless vascular plants, and that includes the lycophytes and the manilophytes. Now let's talk about the seedless non-vascular plants first, since they just have the typical 5 traits that most plants have, or land plants have. So we'll go ahead and move right into the seedless plants. Now, mosses and these other non-vascular plants, they have a dominant gametophyte. So remember the alternation of generations, which you were already introduced to in the first segment, that the mosses and all the non-vascular plants basically have the gametophyte is the dominant, so it's longer living, it's larger. So the bryophytes include 3 phyla, and these phyla are generally they're small plants, and they're herbaceous, meaning that they're not woody, they don't have woody stems. And this includes the liverworts, and the phylum associated with liverworts is Hepatophyta. Then the mosses. The moss phylum is Bryophyta. So again, I want to make sure that you know the difference. The Bryophyta is the phylum for mosses. Bryophytes is the term that's used collectively for all 3 of these phyla. And then we have the hornworts. This is the phylum associated with hornworts is Anthocerophyta. So like I said, the gametophytes for these are dominant, so they're larger and they're longer living than the sporophytes of the life cycle. Now, these are all restricted to moist environments, and they do not generally grow tall because they do not have vascular tissue. They're restricted to moist environments because they have sperm that have flagella. Of course, the flagella need water of some sort so that they can swim and find the egg. And this is what I mentioned when I spoke of the alternation of generations, and we saw the detailed description of moss alternation generations. Now, many bryophytes also reproduce asexually. So we kind of talked about the sexual reproduction in the alternation of generations, but some of them produce other structures which allow them to reproduce asexually. And these include broad bodies, or what's called gemme. So this shows a gemme cup right here. Broad bodies may be leaf-like structures, right, which are going to basically break off. They're often called plantlets, and they're going to basically fragment, and then they can germinate, or they'll start growing, and they'll basically grow into something that's, another plant that's genetically identical to the parent plant in which they broke off from. Now, let's talk about the sporophytes of the bryophytes. So the sporophytes are going to be dependent on the gametophyte. Remember, the gametophyte is dominant to this, and it's longer living. The sporophyte will basically emerge out of the gametophyte during the course of the life cycle, which we saw in the previous segment. So the sporophyte consists of a foot or a setae. So the foot is really where it kind of attaches to the gametophyte, or it's connected with it. Then we have the setae, which is the stalks, okay, and a sporangium. The sporangium is the structure which is also called the capsule. Now, the capsule is often covered with something, okay, and this cover could be in operculum or peristome. Okay, so it could be one or the other. Well, basically, the operculum or the peristome is going to either pop off or open up and allow the spores that are being produced inside it to be distributed into the environment. Now, if we look at a microscopic view of the capsule, okay, so we have the foot, the setae, and then inside the capsule we have the spores, right? So this is the sporangium, the whole thing, and then the spores are produced in there. Now the spores will be released, and then they can germinate and then develop into a gametophyte. Now, if we look at the hepatophyta, the hepatophyta, a common name for them is the liverworts. They do not have stomata, so this is a key characteristic of hepatophyta, or the liverworts. So we have the marchantia, and we can see that we have the female gametophyte here. So they have different structures for the female and male, which you'll see in the lab manual. And then this is the thallus portion of the gametophyte. So it's really like a flattened portion, which may have gamete cups associated with it, which is closest to the ground. And then this is a leafy looking liverwort. The anthocerophyta do have stomata. This is the sporophyte here, and then of course the gametophyte is going to be closer to the ground. And again, what always applies for these non-vascular plants is that the gametophyte is going to be larger or more dominant, and the sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte. Now, for anthocerophyta, the hornworts, there's often algae associated, or cyanobacteria associated with it, so it kind of gives it a bluish green appearance, which will be described in your lab manual. And we have the mosses. They do have stomata. The mosses are what we've seen already. We saw the alternation generations. We can see the gametophyte is larger and more dominant, and then the sporophyte emerges from the gametophyte, and this is the one that has the capsule-like structures with the stem-like structures. Now, mosses have quite an important role in ecology. Some mosses, they help keep the loss of nitrogen in the soil relatively low. So, of course, the loss of nitrogen in the soil is going to have a detrimental effect on those organisms that utilize that oxygen, like cyanobacterium. So it helps reduce that nitrogen loss. And I believe there is an experiment described in your textbook talking about that. Now, sphagnum is actually called peat moss because it forms peat. So peat is basically partially decayed organic material, and this is extensive deposits can be used as a source of fuel. So basically, it's at the beginning stage of forming coal and other traditionally known reserve organisms. So it helps maintain the pH at a level which can preserve really old organisms like this mummy dating 405 to 100 BC. So it's pretty old. So again, preservation of these types of organisms allows us to be able to study them a little bit better. Now we're going to move into the seedless vascular plants, but first we're going to talk about vascular tissue. Seedless vascular plants have vascular tissue, and vascular tissue allow the organisms to do a number of things. So the earliest vascular plants date to about 425 million years ago. Now, vascular tissue allowed these plants to grow very tall. They are still restricted to moist environments because they do have flagellated sperm. Remember, the flagella need water so that they can swim and find the egg for fertilization to actually occur. Now, earlier vascular plants had independent branching sporophytes. Okay. Later on, this allows them to develop into modified types of sporophytes, and we're going to see those as we go through. So you can see there are stomata, right? So this shows some stomata and the green structures of the sporangium. All right, okay, so again, the vascular tissue allowed the plants to grow a lot taller. And we'll talk about why and how it allowed the plants to grow taller. Now, this provides an advantage, right? Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages to living on land. Okay, we should have already talked about that. Now, the sporophytes here are dominant, and they're more complex than the gametophytes. So remember, in the seedless non-vascular plants, it was the gametophyte that was dominant. So now we're moving into a trend where we're going to see the sporophytes become a lot more dominant and more complex. Now, living vascular plants are characterized by the following characteristics. So these are characteristics of vascular plants. They have life cycles with dominant sporophytes, which I just talked about. They have vascular tissues, and this includes the xylem and the phloem. And they have well-developed roots and leaves. So like plants, like the non-vascular plants, do not have very well-developed roots, if any roots at all. So they do have well-developed roots and leaves, and there's reasons for that. We'll talk about that. And they have spore-bearing leaves called sporophylls. So some of them, like I said, they had the earlier vascular plants had these branching sporophytes. Well, now they're going to start to get modified more like these spore-bearing leaves, and they're called sporophylls. All right, so the xylem and phloem, again, are the vascular tissue. Okay, so we're going to talk about the transport in each one of them. So the transport in the xylem, what happens is the waters in minerals are transported from the ground. Okay, so the tracheids are what make up the xylem. These are the tube-shaped cells that are shown here. And what allows them to stand up against the force of gravity is lignin. It provides structural support. The phloem allows sugars and amino acids and other organic materials to be transported. So what's going to happen, we have these leaf cells, and then we have the which are like the root cells. Okay, so we've got the leaf cells, which are going to collect the sunlight where the sugars are going to be built. Okay, and then there's a companion cell which allows the transport of the sugars across the membrane into the phloem, and then this allows translocation of the glucose or sucrose, which is the sugars that are made from photosynthesis. So roots, they basically anchor the plants into the ground. Now, this is the first group of plants that where roots evolved. So those plants that do not have vascular tissue do not have true roots. So the roots, again, allow the plant to be anchored into the ground, and also it allows the absorption of water and nutrients from the soil. Now, it's thought that they may have evolved from subterranean stems. Okay, so what I mean by that is stems that originate from. Now, leaves allow the plant to obtain more sunlight. The larger the leaf, the more surface area, right? And remember, in the leaves, you have stomata, especially in these types of plants, and this allows gas exchange. And then, of course, they're green, and this is where the chloroplasts are going to be. And inside the chloroplasts are chlorophyll. And it's the chlorophyll that captures the sunlight. So the leaves, the larger the leaf, the more efficient and more photosynthesis that can happen. So there's there's two types of categories of leaves, the microphylls and the megaphylls. Now you can imagine just by the name, the microphylls are smaller and the megaphylls would generally be larger, providing more surface area. So the megaphylls would probably be better over the microphylls, but any leaf is better than no leaves. So let's look at the microphylls. They're often small and more like a spine-shaped leaves with a single vein. Okay, so there's no branching veins inside each of these. Okay, so those are the microphylls. And the megaphylls are generally going to be a lot larger and more flattened with a greater surface area. And within the leaf, there's vascular tissue, which is more branched. So let's talk about the sporophylls. And there's other variations of these. The sporophylls are modified leaves that contain or possess sporangium on them. Now, this represents a fern right here, and you can see clusters on the backside of the fern. Now, the fern leaves are called fronds. So on the backside of these are these clusters of spores, or clusters of sporangia specifically, and they're called sori. Okay, so the sori are clusters of sporangia. Now, inside each of the sporangia are the spores. Okay, so the spores or the sporangia, when you wet them, and you'll see this experiment in the lab manual, you're not actually going to do it, but when you wet them, it makes them open up. And then when they open up, they're going to release the spores. Now, there's also what's called strobili. And these are cone-like structures. Now, these are not the same cones that are found in, for example, a pine, which is within the major group of seed plants. Okay, so these do not produce seeds. These just produce spores. Okay, but they do look like cones in some cases, especially this one in the center. Okay, but these are the different variations of the strobili. Okay, so these are the cone-like structures that are found in the seedless but vascular plants. Now let's look at the phylogeny, right? So now we're looking at the seedless vascular plants, and we've got the two major groups. We have the lycophytes and the manilophytes. So the lycophytes are where you're going to find the microphylls. So those are going to be the smaller leaf structures. And then the manilophytes are where you're going to find the megaphylls, especially in the ferns. So let's look at this. We've got the two major clades. The lycophytes include the club mosses, the spike mosses, and the querworts. Now, these are not true mosses. True mosses do not have vascular tissue, and they do not have well-developed roots like these organisms do. Now, most of these plants are still small and herbaceous type plants. However, they do have vascular tissue. So that's what makes them different from the non-vascular, the bryophytes, the true mosses. Now, the phylum Manilophytes include the ferns, the horsetails, and the whisk ferns, and then there are some relatives of those as well. Now, the ferns are probably the largest in terms of numbers of types of plants within this group. Now, let's look at some examples. All right, so we have some club mosses. So this shows club moss with a strobili. These are the clusters of the sporophylls. Remember, these are modified leaves with spores on them. And then we have a spike moss. Okay, so you can see the flattened leaves like structures, but they're relatively small and they live close to the ground. Again, these are not true mosses. They're just commonly called the club moss and the spike moss. Now, here's some additional lycophytes. Okay, so you can see these are relatively small. They live close to the ground, right? They do not grow particularly tall. However, they do have vascular tissue. Now let's look at the manilophytes. So your textbook kind of cites about how many species of ferns there are. There's probably quite a bit more. So it's a very widespread type of plants, that exist on Earth. Now they are quite diverse, and they often, are found in the tropics. But they can also thrive in other types of environments, like the temperate forests. So here we can see a fern. And then horsetails belong in this group as well. Equisetum is one that you'll be looking at. And again, the equisetum have two types of, I guess, stems, if you will. We've got a fertile stem, which has a strobilus on it, and then we have the vegetative stem. And you can see the distinct ring of leaf-like structures that are found all the way up the stem. And then, of course, the strobilus looks more like a cone because it's a cone-like structure. And here's an example of a whisk fern. Okay, so these look more like those ancestral vascular plants that I mentioned early on in the segment. But they're actually more closely related genetically to the modern ferns. All right, so summary, we've discussed the seedless plant phylogeny. Seedless plants, remember, include the non-vascular plants and the vascular plants. The non-vascular groups are the bryophytes, and that includes the phylum Hepatophyta, the phylum Bryophyta, and the phylum Anthocerophyta. And then I discussed all of the key traits of vascular plants, including the vascular tissue. So the vascular and seedless plants include the phylum Lycophyta and the phylum Manilophyta. Now let's talk about the seed plants.